Well, several big issues. There's prevention, there's treatment. Now, in prevention, the key thing still is tobacco. 30 years ago, when we were writing about the causes of cancer in the United States, we said that about 30% of all US cancer deaths were due to tobacco. That was far more than the sum of all the other reliably known causes put together. And in the United States, that proportion rose a bit, then fell a bit, but it's still around 30%, so that figure is still about true. But the difference is that in those days, tobacco deaths were rising. Now tobacco deaths are falling, but still it's 30%. In the United Kingdom, a quarter of all cancer deaths are due to smoking. In the European Union, the same is true. And the governments are taking smoking seriously now. The British government's just passed laws that all cigarettes have got to be sold in plain packages. Let's hope many other countries do similarly. But we've got to take this seriously, and we're going to have to continue to take it seriously for many decades. I mean, in 2050, smoking is still going to be one of the main causes of cancer, the main causes of premature death in rich countries. People talk now about we're now into the tobacco end game. Well, in many places it's not ending and it's not a game. Take China, I mean, that's the most important example. There's 300 million smokers. Chinese men constitute 8% of the world's population, but they smoke 40% of the world's cigarettes. Back in 1990, cigarettes were causing 10% of all deaths from all causes in Chinese men. Now it's 20%, and by the 2030s it's going to be about 30%. Now you put that increase from 20% of all male deaths to 30% of all male deaths, you put that together with the increase in population that's taking place in China, and you're going to go from about 1 million deaths from smoking now in China to 2 million by the 2030s and 3 million by mid-century, just if present patterns continue. And of course, if the women start smoking, then there'll be that added to it as well, but mainly it's the men. I think if we see it just as a question of tobacco industry villainy, then we're actually missing the point. This is addictive. Russia, China, Eastern Europe, there was no tobacco industry advertising, and yet you got 2/3 of the men smoking. So it's not just a question of industry villainy. I think you've got to say, why is it that people smoke? How can we help explain the risks, and how can we help people to escape from those risks? Well, the obvious things are the infections, the human papillomavirus infections, hepatitis B, H. pylori for stomach cancer, although it's not quite so obvious how to really reduce exposure to that. And we have vaccines against those viruses, at least, against hepatitis B and against the most important types of human papillomavirus, and these vaccines are being used. Hepatitis B vaccination is now getting about 80% coverage worldwide, 80%, it's wonderful. And human papillomavirus HPV vaccine isn't yet up at those levels of coverage, but it could be. So we can vaccinate, but the thing is, you're vaccinating either in infancy, in the case of HPV, or in childhood for HPV, against death from cancer in middle and old age. So these vaccination campaigns will have a big effect on cancer mortality in the second half of this century, but they will not have a big effect on cancer mortality in this half of the century. And again, with smoking, if we can get kids not to smoke, that's great. It'll reduce cancer deaths in the second half of the century, but not the first half of the century. If we want to avoid large numbers of the 300 million or so tobacco deaths this side of 2050, we've got to get those who now smoke to stop. And the key thing on that, well, one of the key things is price. At the moment, the governments of the world make $300 billion per year in either profits on making cigarettes or taxes on the sale of cigarettes. So the governments of the world make 300 billion a year. Now, this is not big money for governments. It's reasonably big money, but not enormous. They lent 700 billion to try and bail out the banks in a big crash. So it's big enough to be interesting, though. And if the World Health Organization achieves its aim of a 1/3 reduction in tobacco consumption by either 2025 or 2030, I mean, there have been two separate goals, but the aim anyway is a 1/3 reduction. Now, if prices stay the same, and and tobacco sales go down by a third, the governments of the world lose 100 billion. But if you increase excise taxes on tobacco, so the prices increase substantially, and you're doubling the overall price of tobacco by means of excise taxes, then that alone would reduce consumption by a third. But in that circumstance, the governments of the world would gain 100 billion. Now, I don't believe that the governments of the world are really going to encourage the loss of $100 billion, but I do think they could be persuaded to accept 100 billion by doubling the price. Obviously, in treatment, because we're sequencing the cancers now and we're understanding the mechanisms, it might be we're going to get very specific treatments for very specific cellular abnormalities. That could well happen. And the best example of this is an anti-cancer drug that got invented 50 years too early, which is tamoxifen. Now, it's a 21st century drug. It takes a particular mechanism in the cancer cell, blocks it, and then has a huge effect on long-term survival. And you know, if you just give 5 years of tamoxifen, which is out of patent and for most women is really quite tolerable, though some get side effects that really are uncomfortable, then you can reduce the 15-year risk of death from breast cancer by about a third. And it seems now that if you use slightly different endocrine treatments, which are also out of patent now, aromatase inhibitors, then these have a slightly greater anti-breast cancer effect even than tamoxifen. And it seems in both cases that if you continue beyond 5 years of treatment, then it seems as though 10 years of treatment with endocrine therapy will substantially reduce 20-year cancer mortality. And chemotherapy for breast cancer, simple chemotherapy, not very complicated chemotherapy, surgery, accurate surgery, we can make surgery more accurate, and then radiotherapy. If you've done breast conserving surgery, you do need to give radiotherapy to the conserved breast, otherwise you've got quite a risk of local recurrence. These things, better local control and quite cheap systemic drugs, actually have in total reduced British breast cancer mortality by more than half since 1990. So if you say what's the probability that a British woman is going to die from breast cancer before she's 70, then these risks were drifting up during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, just drifting gently up, and then suddenly these treatments start to become available, and it turns over and goes steeply down, and it's now less than half of what it was. Now, a lot of those treatments would be available in the cities of middle-income countries. So you could have the simple breast cancer treatments available. The problem, of course, is people don't turn up early enough, and various other things, but that's an example. Intestinal cancer is another example where actually there's been a succession of moderate gains, and actually the national death rates are down by quite substantially. If you look at UK intestinal cancer death rates, they've come down. Death rates are drifting down due to a lot of sort of not very striking improvements in treatment, and I think a lot of that could be spread at least to the cities of middle-income countries. Oh yes, it depends on the type of cancer. Of course, with cervix cancer, when you're screening for cervix cancer, you're not going for early detection, you're going for detection of lesions before they are cancer at all. So you're actually preventing cancer arising by finding things that might turn into cancer and taking them out before they do. So that can work well where it's practicable to organise it. But if you take worldwide, yes, I mean, a lot of the places with quite a lot of cervix cancer could get screening better organised. I think, and there's plenty of prospects that the use of HPV tests, testing for the causative virus, could improve the screening procedure and mean that unskilled staff could actually do the screening. The trouble is that it's really quite complex to interpret slides down microscopes, whereas tests for particular types of virus could be done by trained technicians who aren't anything like as highly trained as the histologists. For the general community, the key thing is just don't mix up big causes with small causes. Smoking is enormous. It's something that those who smoke can do something about. We're going to have hundreds of millions of tobacco deaths over the next few decades, and if you are a smoker, then stopping really works ridiculously well. If you can stop smoking before you're 40, then you'll avoid more than 90% of all the risk of tobacco killing you. If you can stop before 30, you'll avoid more than 97. Of course, it's better not to have started, but that's not much use if you already smoke. So if people smoke, then stopping really works. And I think that the WHO's present concerns about nicotine delivery devices, I think, are misplaced. There's a debate on this today. I think that they should be encouraged. Yes, it is an addictive drug. An addiction to nicotine is causing 5 million deaths a year. That's 10 times as many as the total number of deaths from malaria, because that's what's making people smoke. But I think that the nicotine delivery devices, if they're not marketed in ways which cross-market, which cross-brand with cigarette smoking, really have quite a lot to offer. And I think that we're worrying so much about whether we can guarantee the safety of the nicotine delivery devices, but certainly we can guarantee the danger of continuing to smoke. So I think that I would say, yeah, stop smoking. Most people have stopped smoking without any pharmacological help. If pharmacological help helps you, then use it. Just do take that seriously. More than half of all smokers get killed by stopping works. It's your choice. I think a lot of the other concerns are perhaps exaggerated, and that they can divert attention from the fact that one thing is bigger than everything else put together in most places. Now, obviously, if you're a woman living in some part of China where there's still a lot of aflatoxin contaminating stored foodstuffs, then this is irrelevant. You know, most Chinese women don't smoke, and you know, HPV vaccination is no use. You can vaccinate the kids, but that's not going to protect those who are already born. And you can reduce aflatoxin contamination. So the IARC has got a nice handbook on reduction of aflatoxin contamination in poor countries, and that really works. Where you've got enough aflatoxin to really be causing liver cancer, you can reduce it just by changing the way the food is stored. So there are other things to do. There are workplace things. Asbestos was the biggest occupational disaster there ever was. Radiation protection has got to be continued. Do these various things, but don't let the small divert attention from the big. And don't minimise the importance of treatment. You know, treatment, you know, where surgical services are available, you would like health structures to be such that they can be offered. I mean, China has just got health insurance for the rural population. So suddenly a woman in a village who's got a cancer that should be operated on, should be cured in her breast, but who would not previously have been able to do so unless the entire village clubbed together to pay for it, suddenly can go to hospital, and at least she's got the chance that's offered by surgery. And I think this will also have somewhat of a cultural effect, that instead of knowing that cancer kills you, knowing it's better not to know about it, that I think one could get to the point where they would go and get things operated on. So treatment has a serious part to play, but in most countries, basically, in most poor countries, the cancers turn up so late that they're essentially inoperable.